But if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, you'd stop subsidising these things. We spend $11-12 billion a year subsidising fossil fuels. That's odd. You tax the pollution. Economics 101, we think that's impossible. That's odd. And you'd ban things, just like we banned asbestos mines and we banned whaling. It's really complicated stuff, isn't it? You'd ban things that are going to cause harm.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Adam Bandt, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and on last week's episode we talked about the dire warning from the latest IPCC report and the flaws with the safeguard mechanism as proposed by the government, including the fact that it allowed new gas and coal projects to go ahead and had unlimited offsets for polluters. On Monday, Greens leader Adam Bandt announced that a deal had been reached with the government to pass the safeguard mechanism through both houses of parliament with some key amendments.
Well, the government will get its signature climate policy through. They've done a deal with the Greens.
Once again to get something through the Senate.
After years of policy gridlock, the Greens now on board with Labor's revamped safeguard mechanism.
A significant result in the parliament.
To regulate Australia's biggest polluters and get their emissions down over time.
They're describing as a hard cap on emissions.
The Greens have secured a big hit on coal and gas.
We know that these reforms are not going to do enough on their own, but they are a strong start.
But there's more to do, because it is crystal clear that Labor wants to keep opening new coal and gas mines.
Is a long way from what the science says is needed to stop warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Labor and the Greens are all over the shop. They're drunk with joy about having done a deal, but it's going to be the Australian people that cop the hangover.
Lasting ceasefire in the so-called climate wars remains unlikely.
Labor Party has announced a plan to deindustrialise the Australian economy.
Must be no new oil, gas or coal projects or expansions if we are to leave a planet that is livable for future generations.
Richard Dennis, our Executive Director, is just back from Parliament House to help explain the details of that deal and what it means for Australia's emissions. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb.
So, Richard, what exactly have the Greens reached a deal on? What changes are going to be made to the safeguard mechanism?
Yeah, look, the Greens have negotiated a number of good amendments to a bad bill. The safeguard mechanism really was a low point in Australian policy. And to start at the beginning, a lot of people thought we needed to pass the safeguard mechanism to get something into place. I hate to break it to you, it was already in place. The Liberals introduced the safeguard mechanism in 2016. So for the people that think that the safeguard mechanism is this important foundational piece of climate policy infrastructure, well, yeah, the foundation's laid by the previous coalition government. So this debate that's going on is about how the Liberals' safeguard mechanism should be amended, and indeed the fight has not been about do we need foundations, but what to build on top of those foundations. So, as you said, there were lots of problems with the original safeguard mechanism, unlimited offsets in particular, and no restrictions on new coal and gas. What the Greens have negotiated is quite interesting. It's a hard cap on absolute emissions. So kind of put offsets out of your mind for a moment. All this focuses on is the absolute emissions coming out of the facilities covered by the safeguard mechanism. And hold on to your hats that now the object of the Act is that those emissions from the covered sectors have to fall over time.
Amazing.
Crazy talk. Now, will they fall as fast as the science says we need? No, not even close. Will new coal and gas projects still be able to get up under this hard cap on new emissions? Yes, but they won't all be able to get up. What this does is actually, as the name suggests, create a hard cap for emissions from these big polluters. And the only way for a new coal mine or gas project to be approved is if there's been an absolute emission reduction, not offsets, an absolute emission reduction somewhere else in that part of the economy. So that's, a surprisingly big change, I think, given where the government was at just a week or two ago.
Yeah.
And to be clear, the science says we need no new coal and gas. These amendments don't prevent all coal and gas getting built, but a large percentage of the gas and coal projects in the pipeline couldn't go ahead under this new hard cap.
The deal does put a big dampener on the prospects of new gas projects going ahead because of the costs that will be imposed on projects to reduce their emissions.
New projects come online, or if those projects that are in the system already start expanding, and it's going to lift pollution above this hard cap that now has to decline. The minister has to take steps, otherwise they will be in breach of the law.
I receive, or the Minister of the day receives advice from the Climate Change Authority, or as a result of new proposals that is being threatened or is being exceeded, then there are obligations on me, on the Minister of the day, to consider options.
So the hard cap, you previously have criticised the safeguard mechanism as a cap and trade policy without a cap.
Yeah, I'm missing the important bit.
And so I just want to make that distinction clear for people. When you say an actual real hard cap on emissions, why is that different to what we were talking about before? Is that offsets are making the difference there?
No. So under the original scheme, the safeguard mechanism, each polluter that was covered by the safeguard mechanism, and they were big polluters that put out more than 100,000 tonnes of CO2 a year, each big polluter was given their own personal private cap. And their own personal private cap had to decline a bit over time. And it was up to them how they met their own personal private cap, and they could reduce their emissions or they could buy as many offsets as they wanted. So there were 215 projects covered by the safeguard mechanism, and each of those 215 projects had their own special, unique little cap, and they could buy all the offsets they wanted. But then if the 216th or 17th or 18th or 300th project showed up and said, hey, can I start polluting too?
Can I get my little personal cap?
Yeah, I want a little personal cap. Under the original safeguard mechanism, the answer was sure, no problem. Let's figure out how much pollution you're allowed to have. And while each individual polluter had a cap, there was no overall cap on the emissions. So all those 116 fossil fuel projects that were proposed, each of them could have been given their own little personal cap. And when you add those new personal caps to the personal caps of the 215 facilities that were already there, hey presto, Australia's emissions are going up.
Not down.
Not down, even though we have this, new bit of climate policy.
Yeah.
So the Greens amendments are clever in a legal way, because you can only amend the bill that's in front of you. And what these amendments do is say, well, let's just put all that aside. How about we do something simple and say in the object of the safeguard mechanism, the object is to cap emissions, the object is for emissions to fall over time, and to create new obligations on the climate minister to make sure that they're not approving new caps for new projects if the consequence is that overall emissions actually go up.
Are going to breach this hard cap.
This hard cap.
Yeah, okay.
Putting the cap back in the cap and trade.
mean that polluters need to, they can't just rely on those offsets. Sure, offsets will play a part of it, but that hard cap on the emissions will be in place, and will make sure
on emissions, as well as a reduced use of offsets, and it looks like these have been achieved in the.
We're essentially allowing our industrial sector to offset their emissions in the land sector. No other country does that apart from Kazakhstan, for very good reason, is because you want to incentivise actual reductions in emissions rather than allowing fossil fuel companies to use offsets and simply pay to pollute. So that's
one of the other criticisms that we've had at the Australia Institute, based on our research, is around the role of unlimited offsets. Have the Greens managed to get a deal on anything around limiting offsets?
Yes and no. There's no. So each individual polluter can still go off and buy all the dodgy offsets they can lay their hands on. But, and I confess we haven't quite all got to the bottom of this yet, but the biggest method method that's sort of floating around these days, the human-induced regeneration method, which, given a clean bill of health by Ian Chubb just 2 months ago, effectively that's going to get put on hold while each of these projects get audited. Now, I don't think that's going to solve all of the problems with offsetting. I don't. But I do think, given it's the biggest method, this is a really important re-examination. And to be honest, I think a bit of an indictment on the policy process that just 2 months after we have the Chubb review that gave the all clear to something that the government and indeed the industry agree, yeah, maybe if we're going to look into human-induced regeneration credits, we might have to look at each project. Like, not a desktop audit of how the scheme is working, but they're actually going to go and look what's happening on the ground.
And given what we know after some international projects have been audited, who knows how that might turn out, Richard?
I mean, it's embarrassing, isn't it? I mean, Four Corners goes to P&G, audits 4 projects, finds 4 problems.
Yeah.
And everyone else is like, who knew?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should have gone and looked. And while Ian Chubb did some site visits, his review was not a detailed examination of any of the specific projects. So, look, I think we need to keep the pressure up on this. The world is moving away from offsets. Global opinion is really hostile to the kind of projects that Australia's been most enthusiastic and the gas industry have been most enthusiastic about. But I do think it's a big concession to say, well, let's put the biggest method on hold and take a closer look.
Yeah. I think Adam Bandt in his press conference mentioned something like there's no limit on companies using offsets, but if they do use offsets to meet 30% or more of their requirements, then they have to kind of give an explanation of why they're doing that. Why is that important?
Because I think we need to actually have a good old-fashioned conversation about who in Australia is going to reduce emissions. And offsets have just kind of barged in. They've kind of crashed the party, right? For 30 years, people thought that maybe the way to tackle climate change was to mine and burn less fossil fuels, to increase energy efficiency, to install renewable energy, to get people to ride bikes and catch public transport. Like, it's a pretty long, well-worn list. And then in the last couple of years, it's like, I remember that episode of The Simpsons where the guy selling the monorail comes to town, the monorail. It's like the offsets. So we've tipped our whole climate policy on its head in Australia for purely political reasons. No one wants to talk about carbon taxes. Labor didn't want to go to the last election getting accused of driving up the cost of living. And, the gas industry were there grinning saying, maybe offsets could fix it. So I think that offsets have this very small role to play in a very small number of industries, and we've put them in the centre of Australian climate debate. And, the Greens from Balance of Power in the Senate aren't in charge of the legislative agenda for the country, but I think that what they've done here is, put in another mechanism through which voters between now and the election will be able to look into, is this offset stuff really doing anything that helps, or are people just taking the piss a bit?
And if I can just ask you something there, you've kind of harked back to the carbon price, and this is more of a cap and trade kind of a system. How do they differ? How, for example, do we know that this will be effective? What's the market done in response?
What's the market done for us lately? Look, let's be clear. A carbon price would be so much better than all this nonsense. At the moment, what the safeguard mechanism does is force 215 big polluters to buy a lot of dodgy offsets from some other private company that's making a lot of money selling them. I would much rather that money go into consolidated revenue. I'd rather the government be collecting billions of dollars in the scarily known carbon tax, and then we could be spending billions of dollars actually decarbonising the economy, rather than just growing the profits of people.
A giant transfer of wealth from the gas companies to
the offset companies, brackets, who are often part owned by the gas companies.
Yeah.
So a carbon tax would be so much better than this. Getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies would be so much better than this. There are so many, and look, a simple ban on building new gas and coal would be better than this. But, here we are in 2023 still actually having to debate whether building new coal mines helps tackle climate change. I'll leave the politics to the Greens, but what they've done is amend this bill in a way that makes it harder to build that new coal and gas. But if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, you'd stop subsidising these things. We spend $11-12 billion a year subsidising fossil fuels. That's odd. You tax the pollution, Economics 101. We think that's impossible. That's odd. And you'd ban things, just like we banned asbestos mines and we banned whaling. You know, it's real complicated stuff, isn't it? You'd ban things that are going to cause harm. But that's not where we are today. But come the 2025 election, I think more and more voters are questioning how it is building new coal and building new gas help us tackle climate change.
Yeah.
On that basis, it looks like the deal to get the emissions reduction legislation through the Senate with the support of the Greens will actually stop new gas projects because the share prices of Woodside and Santos fell quite a lot, while the rest of the market went up a little bit today.
So, Richard, how have the fossil fuel companies greeted news of this deal?
Well, it's interesting. So far, the stock market's reacted angrily.
Ooh, spooky.
Spooky. Look, according to people who worry about this for a living, the future profitability of gas declined a bit today. So
is that an indication it's likely to be a better deal for the climate?
I think it is. I think it's an indication that the gas industry or the owners of shares in the gas industry didn't see this coming, and that they think it's negative. So if, like me, you think that gas expansion is bad for the climate, then if the people who are banking on gas expansion are feeling less profitable today, that's a good sign. But in terms of the corporates, I think what's really interesting here, come back to that hard cap. If we actually do have an upper limit on actual emissions, then we now have to have interesting conversations about things like, all right, well, if we've only got so many emissions that can fit under this hard cap, should we have a rare earth refinery that's actually adding value to the lithium that we can extract in Australia? Should we do that, or should we build a new gas export hub? So because we've now got a hard cap, we actually have to think, what's the best way to use these emission reductions, at this emission budget? And yesterday, that was a silly question. Yeah. Yesterday is like, there's 116 new fossil fuel projects. Someone wants to start refining lithium too. Great.
Yeah.
Let's do that. So under the original version of the safeguard mechanism, because every individual polluter got their own individual cap, there was no tension. There was no trade-off. There was no contestation between, do we want to spend our carbon budget on coal and gas, or would we rather spend it on adding value to rare earths? As of the passage of this bill, that'll be a very live and willing conversation. So if you're the Minerals Council of Australia, do you think that we should be developing, the lithium and adding value to lithium in Australia? Or do you think we should be building new coal and gas? You watch the Minerals Council and the peak bodies wriggle away from the implications of this hard cap, which is that we'll have to make hard choices.
Climate wars are in retreat, Mr. Speaker.
After a wasted decade under the coalition, today is a very good day indeed.
Negotiating with Labor is like negotiating with the political wing of the Coal and Gas Corporation.
A lasting ceasefire in the so-called climate wars remains unlikely.
Let's be honest, we are in the climate crisis. It is here. And this bill goes some way to deal with some of the pollution, but there's an awful lot more we still have to do. And the Albanese government are not going to get away with doing nothing more before the next election.
So, Richard, we've got this deal with the Greens. Jackie Lambie has said that she's likely to pass it. David Pocock, the independent senator from the ACT, also likely to be supportive of this new deal secured with the Greens. But what is the politics from here on out for climate change policies?
I think that the reality is there was a very real chance the Greens were going to vote this bill down because it wasn't very good. And I think that came out of a sense of conviction of the MPs, combined with the assessment that the voters could see that 100% offsets and no limit on any gas project was a joke of a climate policy.
Yeah.
Let's be clear, the only reason that the Greens were able to secure these amendments is the government was worried that the bill wouldn't pass at all, that the Greens would vote it down. Now, politics is tricky, democracy is tricky, but negotiation's not that hard. Imagine you were selling a car and I wanted to buy your car. Imagine if I showed up and went, wow, that's a great car. I want to buy your car. Let's haggle on the price.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't get too far. So in order for an individual senator or a political party to extract significant amendments from the government of the day, there has to be the threat to walk away. So, the Greens clearly made that threat, and the government clearly believed that threat, and that's why I think we've seen these amendments introduced. I think the Greens have negotiated in good faith, but negotiated in good faith doesn't mean you're going to say yes. And I think a lot of people, including some environment groups, have probably misunderstood the simple art of negotiation, which is you can't get a better deal if you've signalled in advance that you're a buyer at any price. So I think the Greens' willingness to walk away, whilst concerning some, is actually essential. The idea that someone should pass the bill but strengthen it, it doesn't mean anything. It's like, promise you'll buy the second-hand car, promise you won't miss out on it, but get the best price you can.
Yeah.
Just not how it works. And then, what does that mean for David Pocock and others in the Senate at the moment? Well, with 2 votes from the Jackie Lambie party and the Greens, that's likely to be enough for the bill to pass. People are assuming, based on Senator Lambie's comments, that she'll vote for the bill. But I would hope that David Pocock and Lydia Thorpe and indeed other senators might still express a strong view about not just the passage of the bill, but where we need to go next, because the science is clear. We've heard from the IPCC, the UN, the IEA that we need to stop building new coal mines. This bill doesn't do that, but I think the more parliamentarians making clear where we need to end up, the quicker we might get there.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded live on Monday the 27th of March 2023, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a double N-double-T. Richard is at RDNS_TAI. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPhee from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.